Great. Well, hey, everybody. My name's Sarah McAnulty. I run Skype a Scientist. And today we are going to be answering all of your questions about ancient tool archaeology and what being an archaeologist is all about. And also maybe if you want to talk about atlatl and what the heck that even is, we can talk about that a bit too. So Angelo, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. Definitely we'll be talking about atlatls because that's what I do the most of. I guess a quick background about me. I live in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I recently graduated with an undergraduate degree in anthropology and archaeology. And within that, I have been focusing on experimental archaeology, which is ancient tool and weapon recreation and the study of ancient technology, as well as using experimental archaeology in education contexts, not just in academic contexts. So using experimental archaeology to teach at a museum or in a classroom in order to reinforce what students are already learning about world history and human history. So I try to make history hands-on in the way that science can be hands-on, because archaeology I like to describe as the intersection between science and history.
That sounds awesome. So can you tell us, first of all, how do you take, okay, like, you're doing a dig or someone is doing a dig. They find this ancient thing. Maybe it's a weapon, maybe it's a tool. Mm-hmm. How do you take this like often probably broken, very old thing and figure out what it was like when the person was using it originally?
That's a great question. It's definitely a lot of trial and error and a lot of use of the scientific method to test, make hypotheses about what you think a certain tool would have looked like if it wasn't broken, and then how it would have been used when it wasn't broken, and testing that hypothesis by setting up some sort of experiment. And that's where the experimental archaeology comes from. And that's why specifically experimental archaeology is such an intersection of science and history, because of how committed it is to the scientific method to answer precise questions about technology in the past.
Very cool.
So yeah, it could start with the question, what is this tool used for? Is it a digging tool? Well, let's set up an experiment to test its efficiency in digging compared to other means of digging. Is it a hunting tool? Well, let's set up an experiment to test its efficiency in hunting. It's hard to know exactly how something could have been used in the past, but we try to make inductive arguments about what things were likely used for in the past based on how efficient it is in accomplishing a task compared to other technologies to achieve the same task.
That's very cool. So could you explain to us like what is one experiment that you've done and like what's that like look like?
So very recently, actually, I participated in a cool experiment involving atlatls and stone tools. So this will kind of be a crossover into those subjects, where collections of a specific style of stone point, projectile point, have been found in deposits in California. And many of them have specific patterns in their breaking. So we find a lot of broken points, and a lot of these points seem to be broken in the same way, in what we call a twisting or torsion fracture, okay, as opposed to a bending or snapping fracture. So here's an example of a point, and this is one that I've made for experimental purposes. So this is chipped out of obsidian, and a bending fracture would happen if this hits a flat object and snaps almost cleanly in half. So the way these are made, there are specific weak points, and we can kind of tell how it was broken depending on what it looks like when it's broken. So a bending fracture would snap in half straight across. A twisting fracture would snap more diagonally, because as this piece is twisting into an object, it puts opposing forces and it snaps it and twists it. So the fracture will actually be curved. There's an archaeologist in California, Dr. Teresa Barquette, who was trying to understand what caused these twisting fractures in the archaeological deposits that she was excavating in. So she had three hypotheses. The first was that they were from stabbing spears, so thrusting spears, or what they call finishing spears, that perhaps as humans stabbed into an animal and twisted to cause carnage, it put stress on the tips and broke them.
Uh-huh.
Her second hypothesis were knife blades. So if you have a larger piece like this and you're using it like a hand knife, as you're cutting, you could be putting a twisting force and snap your point that way.
Mhm.
And then her third hypothesis was that it was from an atlatl throw. And atlatls are 6-foot throwing spears that most humans use to hunt large animals prior to the invention of bow and arrows. And I have been making and throwing atlatls for about 12 to 13 years now. And her specialty is in the recreation of the points, but she's not necessarily someone who makes and throws atlatls accurately. So she had me come to Los Angeles, and she set up a target with racks of raw beef ribs. And she had atlatl points, or 6-foot long atlatl spears with full-sized obsidian points that she made attached to them, and had me repeatedly throw these spears at this rack of beef ribs until we broke all the points. And then we could compare what the broken points looked like in our experimental model to what the broken points look like in the archaeological record. And we also built thrusting spears and knife blades and used those until they broke, and then compared the fractures across all of the different experiments.
That's so cool.
Yeah,
so,
it was a lot of fun.
It's also, so sometimes like in molecular and cell biology, maybe you need like 3 mice or whatever to do your experiment. Often with live animals, you need like 3 animals is like good enough to get the data.
Right.
With this, how many, like at the end of the experiment, how many atlatl tips did you have to work with? Like how many throws did you have to do?
I believe we had 8 in total to work with, and 6 successfully broke while hitting the beef rib target. Occasionally misses would, just like in real life, in real hunting situations, misses would happen, and the atlatl dart would hit a rock in the ground or a tree, the trunk of a tree, instead of the animal. And in those situations, we saw bending fractures. But more often than not, when the atlatl darts hit the beef ribs, the dart. One moment, I have an atlatl dart with me. Cool. So, this is an atlatl dart. It's not going to fit in the whole frame, but it's 6 feet long.
Wow.
And the feathers here have a spiral to them that you can kind of see, if I can get it at the right angle.
You can totally see that.
It would cause a twist to go this way as it's flying. And that twist, when you have a 2-dimensional point like this, which is very flat, as it's going and twisting and goes between the ribs, the extra twist snaps it. Right. Yeah. So in our experimental model, the atlatl, the tips broken from the atlatl matched the archaeological record the most, and kind of gave us an insight into how deadly atlatl hunting was in history, because when something like obsidian twists and fractures like that, it breaks into multiple razor sharp pieces, because obsidian is the sharpest material on the planet. It's sharper than surgical steel. So when it, not only is it starting as a sharp razor point, but then it shatters within the animal and into these twisting razor blade shrapnel pieces that cause further hemorrhaging and damage in a hunting situation.
Wow. So here's a question. So you said we used atlatls for a really long time as humans, and then switched to hunting with bow and arrow. Correct. Would only some, like people who lived in some places, have access to obsidian in the first place?
So obsidian is pretty common throughout the world, and places that didn't have, so obsidian's volcanic, and many cultures and people throughout history have used obsidian because virtually every continent has volcanic activity. And even if a continent doesn't have active current volcanic activity, historically the entire Earth is volcanic activity. So you can find obsidian virtually everywhere if you know where to dig. There are, of course, places that have more obsidian than other places.
Mhm.
And we find that societies and cultures that controlled obsidian mining had immense political and economic and social power within their societies. For example, in many Mesoamerican cultures, the color green is seen as a royal color in the same way that the color purple is seen as a royal color in most of medieval Europe. And there's a variety of obsidian that naturally occurs that is green in color that commonly occurs in Mexico, in central Mexico. And Teotihuacan, which was a pre-Columbian Mesoamerican society centered in central Mexico, had control to the largest green obsidian mine. And archaeologists have ways of testing where obsidian artifacts were mined from.
Mhm.
And we have found Teotihuacan sourced green obsidian artifacts as far away as Central America. And that gives us proof that they were trading that green obsidian really far away.
Right.
And green obsidian had special social significance because of its color. So Teotihuacan had a lot of economic trading power because of their control of green obsidian mines. Societies and cultures that did not have access to obsidian often used other silica-based rocks like flint or chert. Silica-based rocks fracture in a predictable way,
Uh-huh.
which is what allows humans to make stone tools, because you need to know how it's going to break to plan your breaks. Window glass is a silica-based rock, essentially. So I could chip window glass using the same principles as chipping obsidian into an arrowhead. And so all what we call tool stones, which are rocks that have the ability to be flaked into stones, have some sort of crystalline structure, either silica-based or similar to silica, that allows them to fracture in a predictable pattern. This, not a full tool, but this is an example of a chert or flint flake. It's still sharp, not as sharp as obsidian. All different types of rocks have trade-offs.
Mhm.
Obsidian is the sharpest, but it is also pretty brittle because it's like glass, so it breaks easily.
Yeah.
Flint or chert, the grains are slightly coarser, so they're not as sharp, but because they're coarser, they're a little bit more durable. So it's a little bit of a trade-off, but humans have used both. Many societies use both simultaneously because chert and flint are also pretty ubiquitous worldwide in terms
Yeah.
of their disposal.
So were most of these tools just like single-use tools?
That's a great question. Yeah. Majority of tools throughout history we're now understanding are what we call ad hoc tools,
Mhm.
which are exactly like what I'm holding here, because this is sharp enough to perform most tasks that you would need a cutting tool to perform.
Right.
If you need to cut some fibers to make rope,
Uh-huh.
which I have an example of somewhere, then you just need something this basic.
Right.
If you are cutting vegetables or meat or digging up or collecting berries, you don't need something too much more sophisticated than this. And when this doles out, you can take a big piece of rock, which we call a core, and strike off using your antler billet.
Whoa.
A new piece. This is a piece of antler. This is what you would use to make a stone tool. So you take a larger piece of obsidian or rock, you'd find a suitable place to strike, and you would strike, protecting your hand with a piece of leather, of course, to not cut yourself. And you could make a simple obsidian flake tool just like this with a razor sharp edge. And when this dulls out, instead of wasting time to sharpen this, which it is possible to do, you just knock off a new ad hoc piece.
Wow.
However, archaeologists often fail to recognize something as simple as this as a tool.
Right.
Because this is also in the process to make an arrowhead like this, you produce waste material that looks like this.
Right.
So it's easy to confuse waste, and it could also be both. They could also be using their waste material for making nice arrowheads as ad hoc cutters and scrapers that would then be discarded and picked up as an archaeologist later as simply waste from the process of making this, as opposed to a tool in and of itself.
Right.
there's also a bias. Everyone carries biases. Archaeologists are no exception.
Right.
And this is a lot cooler to find and study than
Right.
this,
Right.
because you can analyze how this works in a broader weapon system. And
Yeah.
it takes a lot more effort and craftsmanship to make something this refined.
Yeah.
And I have others that are like of different types of materials and different shapes. Um, and these are really cool to find, and archaeologists are biased by what's cool to find and publish. Um, the negative side is that throughout antiquity, a lot of the types of tasks that you would accomplish using an ad hoc tool like this are
Mhm.
tasks that women performed around the household. So there's a kind of a trend to reevaluate ad hoc tools like this in order to have a better appreciation for the role of women in the history of stone tool use and production,
Yeah.
because this would happen only for specific, putting this much effort into tools would only happen for specific applications, and
Mhm.
often applications that involved men.
Right.
And there were a lot of this bias that men were the primary flint knappers. Flint knapping is the name of the process, and that's Knapping.
Mhm.
Flint knapping is the name of the process of chipping stone tools. So
Mhm.
there's this misconception that men were the primary flint knappers. However, we're now realizing that the majority of tool use was ad hoc and probably
Right.
done by women. But it's easy to miss that when you're biased to just finding the cool arrowhead pieces or
Right.
spearhead or atlatl point pieces.
Right. So you said that you make those arrow.
Correct.
How long does it take to make one of those?
It can take anywhere from an hour to 3 hours to make. It starts usually from a larger piece like this that
Uh-huh.
you slowly chip away
Mhm.
into maybe a flake like this.
Uh-huh.
And then you take this flake and you use smaller antler tools to chip
Oh.
away. This is an antler tine, to
Uh-huh.
chip away smaller and smaller until you make a small arrowhead.
Right.
So something like this could have come from a flake that looks like this,
Right.
which came from a core or cobble that looks like this.
Yeah.
So a lot of reduction. Um, and it's just a slow, tedious process of kind of counterintuitively dulling the flake,
Mhm.
taking away the sharp edge in order to reshape it into a sharp edge in the shape that you want.
Right.
When you're flint knapping, you're always doing two things. You're either shaping something by dulling it,
Mhm.
or you're sharpening it. And those two things can kind of be counterintuitive, or I guess in opposition to each other.
Right.
So many times I successfully get points that look in the right shape, that look good in the right shape, but aren't that sharp,
Right.
or points that are very sharp but not
In the
quite
wrong
in the right shape.
shape.
And it's really hard to learn how to balance both things.
Right. Yeah. I would do a terrible job of and also I think my hands would just be one big bloody mess by the end. I don't know how you don't cut yourself.
Oh yeah, I have many scars and cuts all over my hands. I've been flint knapping for about 5 or 6 years, and yeah, over the years I've had so many nicks and cuts and scrapes from obsidian and flint.
Very cool. Okay, so what came first for you? An interest in archaeology or atlatl throwing?
Uh, Interest in archaeology was first. I n- n- told my parents that I wanted to be an archaeologist in kindergarten, and then I told my parents that I wanted to be an experimental archaeologist in second grade. And then I started or studying atlatls in fourth grade, and then making and throwing and competing with atlatl competitions in high school. So it's been a lifelong passion. I first was interested in Egyptology within
Mhm.
archaeology, and then experimental archaeology of Egyptian technology, which is Bronze Age, not Stone Age.
Yeah.
So those would be like Khopesh swords, which are kind of a mix between a sickle and a sword. They're a very, very cool sword in history. And Egyptian composite bow technology and Egyptian sling technology. So I was really interested in that kind of stuff, and especially in archery. And through archery, discovered the atlatl, because the atlatl predates the bow and arrow by about 20 plus thousand years. And a lot of the engineering that goes into atlatls applies itself to bow technology. So a lot of the physics and engineering concepts humans figured out for the bow, they figured out with the atlatl first. And I jumped headfirst into the whole atlatl thing. There aren't that many people who make and study atlatls worldwide.
Yeah.
So I quickly ingrained myself into that community, and I now sit on the board of directors for the World Atlatl Association, and I give talks like this about atlatls to museum groups and schools around the country, and also host and organize atlatl competitions. And I guess I should explain, I showed the atlatl dart.
Yeah.
This isn't the whole weapon. This actually isn't even an atlatl itself. I guess, this would be an atlatl. It's a 2-foot long stick with a handle on one end and a hook on the other end. And the hook of the atlatl connects with a little dimple, a little hole that's in the back of the dart.
Oh.
If I can balance this on screen, which is very hard. There we go. So when you're throwing, what you're doing is you're using leverage to flick forward the spear. So this is a simple machine, a lever. And in fact, this is arguably the oldest evidence of human engineering and simple machines that archaeologists have found in the archaeological record. So being a simple machine, it is the first evidence of mechanical engineering, really, or mechanics. And this concept of things like leverage and center of gravity and mass are all what led to subsequent technological innovations in human history. And atlatls were universal all over the world, predating the bow and arrow on almost every continent, and different people around the world had different styles of atlatl. So, for example, this style has 2 finger holes, and it's very common in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in the American Southwest and Central America, Mexico and Central America. However, there's been some evidence of 2-finger atlatls as far north as Alaska as well. Alaska or Arctic Circle atlatls generally have 1 finger hole, not 2 finger holes, but otherwise are similar and are still a lever used to flick a spear. Generally, Arctic Circle atlatls were used to throw short harpoons at seals from canoe in the Arctic, or to hunt waterfowl.
Yeah.
And this is an example of an atlatl from the Ice Age. This is an exact replica of an atlatl from the Ice Age. This part would have originally been carved out of antler, and there's still a hook here, if you can see that there, and it's tied to a longer handle that would have been used to flick spears to hunt Ice Age megafauna. So different parts of the world had different types of atlatls, but they all worked the same way.
That's cool. That's really fun. Oh, cool. And I feel like we just don't hear about them that much. Is it because a lot of like TV and let's assume that this is not an archaeology person. Like most people are learning about old stuff from like Game of Thrones and like that sort of thing. So a lot of those TV, like fantasy, whatever movies and TV are like later than this was happening, right?
Right. So the atlatl is definitely a hunter-gatherer weapon. Right. And the transition to the bow and arrow throughout history around the world coincides with the advent of agriculture in those areas. So around 15,000 years ago in Eurasia, people start farming or developing agriculture. And instead of moving around place to place, they start living in one place. At the same time that climatically the Ice Age is ending, animals are going from being giant Ice Age megafauna to being the smaller Holocene animals that we are familiar with, like deer compared to moose and caribou, and even smaller, and things like giant ground sloths, saber-tooth tigers, woolly mammoth, towhuskers all go extinct. And those are large, slow animals, which you want to be as far away as possible from and hit with a large impact force. And the atlatl is perfect for that.
Right.
Because the atlatl dart is so much larger than an arrow,
Uh-huh.
it carries so much more mass, so much more impact and penetration power, and it has the ability to carry a very large point
Right.
compared to an arrow, which carries at most a point this big.
Right.
And that's the other thing. A lot of times, because people do not know about or aren't that familiar with atlatls, they mischaracterize projectile points, arrowheads, as arrowheads that are actually atlatl points.
Metalheads.
So you'll see this labeled in a museum as an arrowhead. There is no arrow that is
They can handle that thing.
carrying something this big. This is an arrowhead, and this even is
Pretty big.
on the cusp. This is on the cusp. You could totally put this on an atlatl and it would work. But for many years, things like these were labeled as arrowheads in museums, and things like these were labeled as bird points in museums, which gives people a false impression that these are arrowheads used to hunt deer and these are arrowheads used to hunt birds, which is not at all true. They use the same arrowheads. These arrowheads are sufficient to hunt everything.
Right.
And this might even be a little bit more accurate arrowhead. This is even smaller.
Right.
But this is common for arrowheads throughout the world. Very small. The amount of labor it takes to carve a bow is massive.
Mhm.
And the bow stave, which is a bow stave is a piece of wood, a log that you are in the process of carving into a bow, is very heavy until it's that final bow, because you remove a lot of material. If you are a hunter-gatherer society who is packing up and moving every couple days, you don't want to carry around a 15-pound log while you're carving it into a bow that might take you 3 weeks to do.
Right.
An atlatl you can carve in a couple hours.
Mhm.
So around 15,000 years ago, as the climate's changing and people are transitioning to agriculture in Eurasia, that's when we start seeing concrete evidence of a transition from atlatls to bow and arrow technology. In the Americas, agriculture is not adopted until much later.
Mhm.
Atlatls continue to be used throughout the hunter-gatherer period, particularly in the American Southwest, where we have more preservation of artifacts because it's drier.
Yeah.
And we very clearly see atlatl use end around the turn from BCE to CE.
Mhm.
So there's this period called the basket maker period, which is when they used this type of atlatl in the American Southwest, and it's the last, one of the last cultural horizons of hunter-gatherer groups in the American Southwest.
Mhm.
And after the basket maker period, they moves to the Pueblo period, where they settle around 500 CE and start farming and switch to bow and arrows. So there's this clear link between agriculture and bow technology. And there's only one place in the world where they continue to use atlatls and bows at the same time. And that would be in the Mesoamerican societies. So the Maya and what we call the Aztec simultaneously used atlatls and bows, likely for two probable reasons. They were more warring. They were one of the few state level societies to use atlatls, because other societies became state level societies under the bow after they created agriculture. But the Aztec and Maya attached religious significance to the atlatl as opposed to the bow. So they felt a greater compulsion to continue to use the atlatl for some reasons, either for ceremony or for warfare, because it's a little bit better for warfare in that context. And didn't value the bow as much, but they still had it and used it simultaneously.
Cool. What's like the benefit of, okay, so the bow, it takes longer to make. It is the arrows are smaller. Do you have to you still have to be pretty strong to use a bow? Like atlatls, you gotta whip them, and then a bow, you gotta pull it back and let it loose, but you still have to be pretty strong. Like what's the benefit of a bow, and why do we all switch to bows and stop using this other thing that seems to be pretty good?
Right. So bows have some advantages, but they're not net good across the board.
Right.
It's definitely depending on the context that you're in. So think about the environment during the Ice Age. Because it's colder, there's less trees and there's more open tundra and plains where grazing animals like ground sloths and mammoth are grazing. The atlatl has two things going against it. It's what I like to call visually loud, not that it makes a noise, but this swinging motion is pretty big and noticeable in an open field and takes a lot of room. You need to have overhead room to swing this.
Right.
As the ice age ends in Eurasia, deciduous forests become the dominant biome, and there's more tree cover, and animals are smaller, faster, and more skittish.
Right.
So you have this dual problem of not having enough room, overhead room, to swing your atlatl, and the motion of swinging spooks a deer in a way that it wouldn't spook a mammoth, because mammoths are so big and you could stand further away and have an open shot. The benefit of the way the bow solves this is that the motion it takes to release an arrow is this.
Right.
And a deer is not seeing that. And the arrow itself is traveling at a much, much, much faster speed than the dart is traveling, though it carries less momentum and impact force because it's much lighter. Right. Which matters less because you're not hunting Ice Age woolly mammoth, right? You're hunting a deer which has thinner skin to begin with. Right. Though there are many societies that hunted deer with atlatls, there are modern people who hunt large game with atlatls. It's totally possible. The bow is also going to be more, because it's a point and shoot technology as opposed to a aim and pray technology. There's no way to put a sight on an atlatl, right? The throwing motion is introduces a lot of variables in the trajectory of the throw. Bow reduces the variables to just straightforward. So you can have higher accuracy at longer distances with a bow. However, at short range, a trained atlatl person can be as accurate as an archer. At short distances. At around 15 meters, it's possible for an advanced person in both disciplines to have similar accuracy. But Olympic archery is at 70 meters and they're nailing bullseyes, which is a distance that is just impossible to be consistent and accurate with an atlatl. The maximum, what we call effective range of an atlatl, an effective range is not the furthest you could throw it at a 45-degree angle, like a javelin thrower, but the furthest that you could reliably hit a target in a hunting scenario. So that would require a flat trajectory, because the most accurate and fastest path between 2 points is a straight line. So the further that you can shoot a projectile on a straight line, the more accurate and effective that weapon is. Right. So a gun you can shoot on a straight line for hundreds of yards. Right. A bow you can shoot on a straight line or aim on a straight line for like up to 100 yards. Right. In atlatl you can aim and hit on a straight line up to about 25 yards. Cool. Sounds good. When you're hunting a mammoth, you care less about a straight line because it's a big target and you can arc something from far away. Right. And in warfare, if you have a legion of atlatl throwers throwing at an approaching army of people,
you're gonna hit somebody.
You just want to launch it. You just want to launch it, go far. But in a hunting scenario, 25 meters is around the maximum effective range for an atlatl, which is still, pretty good. That's about 25 meters is like roughly 80 feet.
That's like a swimming pool.
Yeah, 80 to 90 feet is 25 meters.
Swimming pool away. That's pretty good. Yeah. Cool. All right, we got a question here from Mohammed. I'm going to read it directly, and then I'm going to ask you to answer in a way that someone who does not understand the question would still understand, because the question is has words that I don't totally understand. Here we go. Are there any observations regarding the development of arrowheads, the anterior forms until reaching the triangular form?
Yeah. So this is basically asking, when did humans and how did humans figure out that triangles were the best shape for projectiles? It's hard to tell because we don't often, so definitely earlier projectile points were pretty crude. And I may have an example of one, but I also may not, so I apologize in advance. So no, I do not think I have an example of like a really, really rudimentary point. Maybe. Not quite. Okay, so we do have some evidence of like crudely triangular, so not perfectly triangular, but something that has a point of less than 90 degrees that then has to meet up in at the back end somehow. with possible evidence of glue in the back as if it was tied into or glued into an arrow,
Uh-huh.
but it's not concrete or conclusive. Earlier arrowheads, the earliest things that we can concretely call arrowheads, had what we call stems as opposed to
A little like,
notches.
yeah.
And this would be true, I guess, and I'm not even talking arrowheads, I'm talking atlatl points. So stemmed atlatl points are earlier than notched atlatl points. In most parts of the world, if you find a stemmed projectile point, it's pretty safe to assume that that's older than any notched projectile point that you find, whether it's arrow or atlatl. Because notches are harder to pull off because you have a high chance of breaking
off.
Yeah,
right.
we'll call like this, these parts here surrounding the notch, the corner or the ear of the arrowhead. And like, honestly, I made this one. I attempted to make, and this was one of my first arrowheads. I attempted to make a notched arrowhead, broke off the ear, and turned it into a stemmed arrowhead, which is probably exactly why they made stemmed arrowheads back then.
Right.
Like, you attempt notches because notches work, but notches are really hard to do right. And it took many years for me to learn how to make notches that are even and deep and usable. But I have quite a few stemmed points because that's all I could pull off, because I kept snapping off the ears or the corners of my notches. So we do see a progression from stems, or I guess from triangles without any stem at all, to triangles with stems, to triangles with notches. But I think humans just very quickly realized that if you want to penetrate something, you need to have less surface area is better for penetration.
Right.
So a narrower, skinnier arrowhead is better than a wide arrowhead. And so the skinnier you go, the more you're going to penetrate. And some very late arrowheads are not only really tiny, but also very narrow. So there's a style of arrowhead from California called the Wintu points, WINTU, that are very triangular, but like super narrow, almost like a needle on the tip of an arrow, just to get maximum penetration and as little surface area as possible.
Very cool. We've got a question from the Kramer Class of Curiosity. Do you have any tips from making our own tools at home? And also the second question is, would a fat arrowhead break be stronger than a thin arrowhead?
For the first question, definitely I'm a big fan of just experimentation in your garage. That's how I started. I carved my first atlatl out of a 2x4 and some wooden dowels when I was like 12 or 13, and had made like catapults and stuff. But YouTube is a really good resource for learning how to do a lot of people call ancestral skills. And I think one of the basic things to start with is like learning how to collect fibers and process them, twist them into rope. It's kind of just a basic skill that all humans figured out at some point throughout history. And to this day, if you buy rope at Home Depot, it's twisted in the same way that humans learned how to twist ropes hundreds of thousands of years ago. And kind of starting from like the beginning like that can be pretty humbling, because you're like, oh, this caveman figured this out, I should be able to figure this out. And it's can be more difficult than you expect. And the other thing I would say is, like, there are some people who are purists and think that if you're going to make an atlatl, you should be cutting down your own tree, using your own stone tools and carving the whole thing. I don't think so. I think a lot of these pieces of ancient technology, it's more important to have an appreciation and understanding of the engineering principles that go into making them and the engineering principles that humans learned by making them than by the actual stone tool process itself. So I think carving an atlatl out of wood you buy at Home Depot, with wooden dowels you buy at Home Depot, as long as you're doing the research to make sure that from an engineering perspective it matches the historical examples, is totally fine. Use modern materials, use modern tools, use whatever you have at home, but use it in a way where you're still appreciating the technological innovations that ancient humans had to go through in order to understand and develop these technologies.
Very cool. So I tried to mix, I was like trying to make soap this past winter, and I tried to go the purest route at the beginning. I was like, all right, we're gonna make lye from hardwood ash. We're gonna like burn wood and then make the lye from the ash, and then we're gonna like render pig fat and we're gonna make soap. It was a disaster. It was a disaster. I couldn't, like, what we ended up with was not even remotely soap. Like, I don't even think would be safe to put on human skin. It was such a disaster. So the second round we went to Home Depot and like bought lye and used olive oil, and it worked perfectly. So baby steps. The people that came before us were good at what they did, and oh my God, just because I'm a modern human doesn't mean I'm good at anything. So
yeah, definitely. Flint knapping is like one of the most humbling things I've done. It's the hardest thing I've ever taught myself to do, and I'm still pretty terrible at it in the grand scheme of the history of stone tool use and other archaeologists who specialize in this. And I guess to go back to the other question from the Kramer class of curiosity, by fat arrowhead, do you mean wide arrowhead versus a narrow arrowhead, or do you mean a thick arrowhead versus a thin arrowhead? Because we're talking about different dimensions. A thicker arrowhead would penetrate worse because it has more surface area that's not a cutting edge, because it would be, you know, thicker and rounder, and this part here is not cutting, it's just the edges that are cutting.
Right.
But it would be more durable. So something that's thinner definitely breaks more easily. So thick, they're asking about thick. Yeah, so a thick arrowhead would be more durable but less effective in certain contexts, especially with projectile points, because they have more surface area and wouldn't penetrate as deeply as something that's thin and razor-like.
Sounds good. Okay, so we are coming up on time here, and so I have the same two questions that we ask all of our scientists. The first is, if you had everyone's attention in the whole world and you could tell them one thing that relates to your area of expertise, what would it be?
That's a great question. It would be that atlatls are for throwing and spears are for thrusting. There's this misconception based on Hollywood that ancient humans hunted by taking a spear and holding it in the middle like a javelin and throwing it like this at an animal. There's very little archaeological and experimental data that supports that that's possible. The human shoulder is simply not built in a way that allows you to hold the projectile at its midpoint, at its center of gravity, and propel it with enough force on a hunting flat trajectory to hit an animal further than 7 meters away, which is like
very close,
which is pointless, which makes a projectile weapon useless. They did this experiment in 2019 at the University College of London, where they took collegiate level javelin competitors who can normally throw a javelin at an upward trajectory, 45-degree angle, up to 90 meters away. The world record javelin throw is 97 meters, so very, very far. And they asked them to hit a target the size of a deer or a person just 15 to 20 yards in front of them. And not only could they not reliably hit the target, they couldn't even reach the target. So when they're throwing 45 degrees, they can throw 90 meters. But when they're throwing flat, they could only reach 15 meters.
Wow.
And they could only hit the target when it was like reliably when it was within 10 meters.
Huh.
So, and they weren't using Olympic javelins and attempting to throw them on a flat trajectory. They were using an exact recreation of the oldest spears ever excavated, which are 380,000 years old and weren't even used by humans. They were used by Neanderthals. And they were found, it was 6 spears that were 1 inch in diameter and 6 feet long that were found with a bunch of horse bones and carcasses. So we knew it was a horse kill site. The question was, were they thrown or were they thrusted? Seems to be thrusted because throwing just doesn't work. And there's very little what we call ethnographic evidence, which is culture, like observing cultures who still hunt like this. There's only one culture that ethnographically hunts using a throwing spear, and that would be the Maasai warriors in Central Africa or in Africa. I don't know if it's Central Africa, to be completely honest. And even they readily admit that their maximum effective range for throwing a spear is about 7 to 10 meters. And if you watch Spartan races, which are those like Ironman type races, where these really big buff people do this obstacle course, and part of it is throwing a spear. They have to throw a spear about 10 meters and at a straight ahead flat. And many of them barely reach the spear to the target, and the target like the spear barely hangs into the target. It's
Right.
Zero penetration. Whereas
Right.
at 10 meters, I could push this atlatl dart through a target like 6 inches.
Right. Right.
And the world record distance throw for an atlatl is 273 yards, and the world record javelin throw is 97 yards. So even on distance, atlatls have spear feet. So yeah, so atlatls are for throwing. Spears are thrusting weapons. Anytime you see a movie, whether it's like there's a scene in the movie Troy with Brad Pitt where like he throws a javelin like 60 yards on a straight line, which just isn't humanly possible.
Yeah.
Or there's a couple other movies that are set in like Ice Age times where they're hunting buffalo or woolly mammoth by like throwing a spear like that. Which just doesn't happen.
When I think about throwing spears, I think of Brad Pitt immediately in Troy, just like throwing sticks. It's just not happening.
Shoulder, it's not built to work like that.
Right. Cool. Okay. One final question. You still have everyone's attention in the whole world, and you can tell them one thing, but it can be about anything. It can be important. It can be unimportant. It could be whatever you want. What do you tell them?
Oh my goodness. That's so tough.
It's a hard question. Wait a minute.
That's a pretty hard question. So besides archaeology and atlatls, I'm really passionate about music and the history of disco, in particular. And I may or may not work as a disco DJ on the side. So I would, tell people to like give disco a shot. And I know it has a bad rap, but 80+% of disco that people are familiar with when they think about disco only was released between 1977 and 1980, because that's when disco broke out into the mainstream. But disco started in like 1969. So there's an entire almost full decade of disco music that has been lost to time that modern people don't think about at all. But like when you think Good Times, when you think Donna Summer, when you think I Will Survive, when you think Bee Gees, all of that is post 1977. And there's just a lot of this early disco that's like 1973 to 1976. That's really, really good as well. So I would tell people to check that out.
All right. That is a great piece of information. I also love disco. So good answer. I'm going to listen to disco for the rest of the afternoon because you've inspired me. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to plug? Anything else you'd like to leave us with that we need to know about?
If you want to hear more about archaeology and atlatls, I was a guest on Ologies, and the episode is like almost 2 hours long, and I go way, way deeper into the history of stone tool use and atlatls. If you're interested in learning more about me or atlatls, you can follow me on Instagram at @IDigItFirst. I think I can put that in the chat.
Yeah.
And you can also find the World Atlatl Association at worldatlatl.org. And you can find a competition or a meetup, and you can become a member and get access to the Atlatl quarterly newsletter and competition scores for like $15 a year. And then I have my own podcast about music history and disco called Sample Excavator that you can find on Apple Podcasts and on Google Podcasts. It sadly was just taken down from Spotify for copyright reasons. But yeah, Sample Excavator, and I can put that in the chat as well. Episodes 9 and 10 were my disco episodes in particular. So you can find more about me and my passion for music there.
Amazing. And we had a question, do we have a YouTube channel, Skype a Scientist? Yes, we do. All of our videos are always posted to youtube.com/Skype a Scientist. Thank you so much for sharing all this with us. This is really cool. Always love listening to you. So thanks for taking the time to be with us. Kay, thank you for interpreting. And everybody, we'll see you next time. Our next meeting will be all about DNA with Kathleen Gillespie, my gosh. And that's on the 25th. We'll see you then. Until next time, thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.